Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we're diving into a turning point that no one saw coming. What starts as an ordinary day helping catch fish quickly turns into a life-altering moment for Tu Tien. A sudden allergic reaction sends her to the hospital, forcing her and Jack to confront a reality they've both been avoiding. As doctors uncover the truth behind her condition, their simple farm life is shaken, and the future they imagined suddenly feels uncertain. Stay with us until the end, because this chapter marks the beginning of a very different journey for Tu Tien and Jack. One where strength is no longer about endurance, but about learning when to stop. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The morning sun rises slowly over the countryside, warming the fields and turning the thin layer of mist above the pond into a soft silver haze. Jack wakes up earlier than usual, quietly slipping out of bed so he doesn't disturb Tu Tien. He moves through the small house with a lightness in his step, clearly in a good mood. By the time Tu Tien comes out, tying her hair loosely behind her head, Jack is already waiting in the yard, a fishing net draped over his shoulder and a bucket by his feet. "Good timing," he says with a grin. "Uncle Fong called earlier. He's draining part of his pond today. He asked if we wanted to come help catch fish." Tu Tien smiles immediately. She loves these simple, busy mornings, the kind where everyone works together and laughs over muddy feet and flapping fish. "That sounds fun," she replies. "Let me grab my gloves." They ride out on Jack's motorbike, the road stretching red and dusty ahead of them. The air smells fresh, mixed with wet grass and pond water. Along the way, Jack talks about how adding more fish to their own pond could help balance the ecosystem, how he's been reading about sustainable stocking methods. Tu Tien listens, nodding, occasionally teasing him about turning everything into a mini lecture. Jack just laughs, unbothered, clearly enjoying the ride and her presence beside him. When they arrive, the pond is already buzzing with activity. A few neighbors stand barefoot in the shallow water, holding nets and bamboo baskets. Laughter echoes across the surface as fish leap and splash, sending ripples in every direction. Jack immediately rolls up his pants and wades in, helping pull the net tighter. Tu Tien stays closer to the edge at first, handing over buckets and steadying baskets as fish are scooped out. "Careful," Jack calls out. "They're stronger than they look." Tu Tien chuckles. "I can handle it." As the net tightens, dozens of fish thrash wildly, silver bodies flashing in the sunlight. Carp, tilapia, and grassfish tumble over one another, water spraying everywhere. The energy is contagious. Tu Tien steps closer, kneeling at the edge to help guide a basket. She reaches in, steadying a fish that's slipping free, her bare hands brushing against its slick scales. At first, she doesn't notice anything wrong. Minutes pass. Buckets fill quickly, and the group cheers at the size of the catch. Jack lifts a particularly large fish, muscles straining, while Tu Tien laughs and claps from the side. But then she pauses. A strange itching creeps across her palms, subtle at first, then sharper. She rubs her hands together, assuming it's just pond water or mud. "Jack," she calls lightly, "can you hand me the towel?" He tosses it over without looking. "You okay?" "Yeah, just wet," she replies, drying her hands quickly. But the itching doesn't stop. Instead, her skin begins to redden, small raised patches forming across her fingers and wrists. She flexes her hands, feeling a faint burning sensation now. The sounds around her seem slightly distant, muffled by the sudden rush of discomfort. Jack notices her standing still. He looks up and frowns. Tu Tien, why aren't you helping anymore? She forces a smile, just taking a short break. He steps closer, his eyes dropping to her hands. Your skin, it looks strange. Tu Tien instinctively pulls her hands back. It's nothing. Maybe I touched something irritating. Before Jack can respond, Tu Tien suddenly feels dizzy. The ground seems to tilt slightly, and she grabs onto the edge of the basket to steady herself. Her breathing grows shallow, each breath feeling tighter than the last. Jack's smile vanishes instantly. Hey, sit down. Now. I'm fine, she insists, though her voice wavers. Just tired. But Jack isn't convinced. He guides her to sit on a nearby rock, kneeling in front of her. Your face is pale, he says, panic creeping into his tone. Are you having trouble breathing? Tu Tien hesitates. She nods slightly. That's all Jack needs to hear. He stands up sharply. Uncle Fong, we need to leave. Now. Within minutes, they're back on the motorbike. Jack drives faster than usual, gripping the handlebars tightly, glancing back every few seconds to check on her. Tu Tien presses one hand to her chest, the other resting weakly against Jack's waist. Her skin continues to itch and burn, red patches spreading up her arms. Jack, slow down, she murmurs. I can't, he replies. Just stay awake. Talk to me. I'm here, she says softly, though her voice sounds distant even to her own ears. They reach the small local hospital faster than anyone thought possible. Jack practically lifts her off the bike, calling for help as he rushes inside. Nurses move quickly, guiding Tu Tien onto a bed, checking her pulse and oxygen levels. Jack stands just outside the curtain, hands trembling, replaying the scene at the pond over and over in his mind. After what feels like hours, but is really only minutes, a doctor steps out. She's having a strong allergic reaction, the doctor explains calmly. Do you know what triggered it? Jack shakes his head. She was catching fish. Pond water. Fish scales. I don't know. The doctor nods. We've given her medication to stabilize her breathing. She'll need to stay for observation. Jack finally exhales, leaning against the wall as relief and fear collide in his chest. When he's allowed to see her, Tu Tien looks exhausted, but more comfortable. Her breathing has eased, though faint red marks still linger on her skin. I'm sorry, she whispers when she sees his face. I didn't know it would be this bad. Jack sits beside her, carefully taking her hand. Don't apologize, he says quietly. Just don't scare me like that again. She manages a weak smile, but her eyes reflect something deeper. Unease, confusion, and a growing sense that this wasn't just a simple accident. As Jack watches over her, unaware of the thoughts racing through her mind, the weight of unanswered questions settles heavily between them, quietly setting the stage for what comes next. The hospital corridor feels colder on the third morning. Or maybe Tu Tien is just more aware of everything now. The allergic reaction itself has faded into the background, but what remains is a deep, unsettling sense that something fundamental has shifted. She wakes up before the nurse's rounds, staring at the pale light creeping across the wall. Jack is still asleep in the chair beside her bed, his jacket pulled up around his shoulders, phone resting loosely in his hand. She watches him breathe, slow and steady, and a quiet ache tightens in her chest. For years, she has measured her worth by how much she could endure. Long days, physical labor, exhaustion she never complained about. Now, lying here, she feels exposed, like something essential has been stripped away. When Jack wakes, he notices her expression immediately. "You're thinking too much again," he says gently. "Maybe," she answers. "Or maybe I finally stopped ignoring things." That morning, they meet with a senior specialist. Unlike the others, this doctor doesn't rush through questions. She sits down, folds her hands, and listens carefully as Tu Tien speaks. Tu Tien talks about her routine in detail. Early mornings, long hours near water, constant exposure to fish feed, algae, untreated pond water. She mentions moments of weakness she blamed on overwork, the itching she thought was just dry skin, the headaches she dismissed as stress. Jack hears all of this for the first time, and it unsettles him more than the emergency itself. These symptoms didn't appear overnight. The doctor explains calmly, "Your immune system has likely been under strain for quite some time. Yesterday's reaction was simply the moment it became impossible to ignore." "So, what happens now?" Jack asks. "Now," the doctor replies, "you learn how to live with it instead of fighting it." The tests that follow are thorough. Tu Tien is moved from room to room, answering the same questions in different ways, her blood drawn more times than she can count. Between procedures, she and Jack sit together in silence. There's no need to talk constantly anymore. The seriousness of the situation has shifted their relationship into a quieter, heavier space. At one point, Tu Tien breaks the silence. "If I had collapsed at the pond alone..." She doesn't finish the sentence. Jack tightens his grip on her hand. "But you weren't alone." She nods, but the thought lingers. By late afternoon, the results are clearer. The diagnosis isn't immediately life-threatening, but it's not something that can be ignored or temporarily treated. The doctor explains that Tu Tien's condition involves severe allergic sensitivity combined with immune overreaction. Environmental exposure, especially to untreated water, fish proteins, and prolonged physical stress, significantly increases the risk of sudden episodes. "You'll need to make adjustments," the doctor says. "Protective gear, medication, and limits. This isn't about fear. It's about control." Control. The word echoes uncomfortably in Tu Tien's mind. After the consultation, Jack steps out to make phone calls. He speaks briefly with family members, careful not to alarm anyone, postpones work, and asks neighbors for help without explanation. When he returns, Tu Tien is sitting quietly, staring at the emergency medication kit placed beside her bed. "I feel like I'm shrinking," she says softly, "like my world just got smaller." Jack sits beside her. "Your world didn't shrink," he replies. "It just got clearer." That night, sleep doesn't come easily. Tu Tien's mind drifts back to the farm, the pond, the nets, the water splashing against her hands. She remembers how proud she felt being able to do everything herself. Now, that pride feels fragile, almost dangerous. The next morning, the doctor returns with a finalized care plan. Regular checkups, strict avoidance of high-risk exposure, medication at all times, immediate response protocols in case of another reaction. There's no cure, the doctor says honestly, but there is a way forward. On the ride home, the landscape passes slowly outside the window. Fields stretch out under the sky, ponds reflecting clouds like nothing has changed. But for Tu Tien, everything feels different. She doesn't feel anger, just a quiet grief for the version of herself she thought she'd always be. Jack breaks the silence. "We'll reorganize the farm." She turns to him. "You say that like it's simple." "It's not," he admits, "but neither is pretending nothing happened." Back at home, Tu Tien feels the weight of familiarity. The house smells the same. The yard looks untouched. Yet she hesitates before stepping toward the pond, stopping herself instinctively. Jack notices. "You don't have to avoid it completely," he says carefully. "Just be smart." She nods, but the hesitation stays. Over the next few days, reality sets in. Jack adjusts routines. He takes over pond-related work completely, fencing off certain areas, wearing gloves and masks even when she isn't around. Tu Tien shifts to indoor tasks, planning, bookkeeping, coordinating supplies. At first, it feels like she's been sidelined, reduced to something smaller. One afternoon, frustration finally breaks through. "I hate this," she says sharply. "I hate feeling like I'm made of glass." Jack doesn't argue. "I know," he says, "but glass can still hold light." The words surprise her. As days pass, Tu Tien begins to notice subtle changes, not just in her body, but in her thinking. She rests more. She listens when fatigue creeps in instead of pushing through it. She carries her medication without embarrassment. Slowly, fear gives way to awareness. One evening, she stands at a safe distance from the pond, watching the fish ripple beneath the surface. The water no longer feels like an enemy, but it's no longer something she takes for granted either. "I used to think strength meant never stopping," she says quietly. Jack stands beside her. "Strength also means knowing when to stop." She exhales, feeling something loosen inside her. That night, they sit together at the table, reviewing plans, making adjustments, talking honestly about the future. There's sadness in the conversation, but also relief. For the first time, Tu Tien doesn't feel like she has to prove anything. Before going to bed, she turns to Jack. "I won't hide things anymore, even when I'm scared." He nods. "And I won't expect you to carry everything alone." Outside, the farm settles into silence. The ponds reflect the moonlight calmly, no longer symbols of abundance or danger, but reminders of balance, limits, and change. Life hasn't ended. It has slowed, reshaped itself, asked for honesty instead of endurance. And for Tu Tien, that realization, though frightening, also feels like the beginning of something more sustainable, more real, and finally shared.